President Biden is spending this Labor Day on the campaign trail in two states, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Both are pivotal in deciding whether Democrats can keep control of the Senate 64 days from now. The president just finished speaking to a union crowd in Milwaukee, and he repeated his warnings to the nation that the fight to stop extremists is a fight for the battle of the soul of the nation.
Not every Republican is a MAGA Republican. Not every Republican embraces that extreme ideology. I know because I've been able to work with mainstream Republicans my whole career. But the extreme MAGA Republicans in Congress have chosen to go backwards, full of anger, violence, hate, and division. But together, we can and we must choose a different path. Forward. No, I really mean it. We have to.
Let's discuss with Alisyn Stewart. She's our CNN political commentator and Republican strategist and former communications director for Senator Ted Cruz. And Zach Patkanis is a Democratic strategist and former rapid response director for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Zach, I'll start with you. Is that, President Biden more and more has been trying to draw this distinction between basically old school Republicans that he knew and worked with and what he calls MAGA Republicans. Is he giving an off ramp to Republicans? Why is he hitting this so hard?
Well, look, I think it's really important what President Biden is doing. He's distinguishing between Republican voters who are mainstream, normal, just want to get by, to have food on the table, to send their kids to school. And Republican leaders who are increasingly showing this level of extremism. And we're seeing it at the rallies. We're seeing it by calls by state legislatures to criminalize abortion, even in the cases of rape and incest. These are things that are Republican leaders' priorities, but not Republican voters' priorities. And distinguishing that is really key to winning the midterms.
Alice, as a Republican, do you take umbrage at him, continuing to go after so-called MAGA Republicans?
He clearly sees this as a winning message in terms of rallying and unifying the Democratic Party. And Alisyn, I hear him now in the last few speeches he's made. He is very clear and very exact in his clarification of his initial statements, where he says he's not talking about all Republicans. He is talking about what he calls MAGA Republicans, and specifically people that were election deniers, that were in support of January 6th, and that are frustrated with the raid at Mar-a-Lago. And he is saying that those people are taking our country in the wrong direction and they're a threat to democracy, and referring to President Trump as enemy of the people. Look, the distinction is not being heard by many Republicans. Many Republicans are hearing him paint all Republicans with that tone, in addition to what he said last week, saying that we are semi-fascist. And that is frustrating to many. Some people are not hearing the distinction, and they're saying that this is a president that ran on unity and optimism and hope, and he is doing nothing more than dividing Republican Party. He touched on that message today on unity and optimism, but it's not being heard by many Republicans. I hear the distinction, but many are already, the cake is baked for a lot of Republicans on this issue.
Yeah, Alice, I want to stick with you for 1 second because Donald Trump had a grievance-filled rally himself this past weekend, and it was very volatile. He went after law enforcement officers, as he's been doing. He called them, quote, vicious monsters. Obviously, the FBI has been facing unprecedented threat levels. Why aren't more Republicans, including, frankly, your old boss, Ted Cruz, saying that that kind of rhetoric has to stop?
I wish I knew the answer to that, and I wish more rational Republicans would be more vocal on this, because there really is, based on what we heard former President Trump say in Pennsylvania, really an alternate reality. And the way he sees these key issues, when we're talking about election denials, January 6th, and the Mar-a-Lago raid, President Trump classified these as the Democrats' overreach and trying to silence free speech. He looked at what happened on January 6th as imprisoning political protesters, and Mar-a-Lago as Democrats' indiscriminate raid of a private home of a political enemy. I don't see it that way at all. Many rational Republicans do not see it that way at all. And the frustrating thing is we had Donald Trump campaigning in Pennsylvania, talking more about himself and President Biden than the two candidates he was there to campaign for. And we have just over 60 days to the midterm elections. Any minute we're spending talking about Trump is a minute lost. We need to be talking about the top issues that are concerned of Americans, and that is cost of living, jobs, inflation, crime, as well as immigration. And those are the issues Republicans would be wise to focus on.
And democracy. I mean, when you poll
Yes,
Americans,
right.
they are quite concerned about the future of democracy. And Zach, one thing that election deniers have done very successfully since January 6th is run for secretaries of state in various battleground states. Do you think that the Democratic Party has been taking this seriously enough and has been combating it well enough?
Well, I'll tell you, it's not just secretaries of state. They're also running for local election official positions that have enormous amounts of power in this process. And I'll tell you, I think that there's been a ramp up in the level of urgency amongst Democrats, but it is certainly not commensurate with the threat. And the threat is very, very big. I mean, we're talking about a slate of thousands of candidates that are running for office who think that even though they lose elections, they still should get power so that they can do the things that we were talking about before, the extremist things, criminalizing abortion in the case of rape and incest. It is very, very concerning, and Democrats need to wake up.
And what can they do at this point? The midterms are 64 days away.
Well, I mean, 64 days is a lot of time in politics, and there are some great organizations that are out there that are taking this seriously, but we need to make sure that the resources are there so the Secretary of State candidates can win. It's crucial.
Alice, very quickly, because I know you were Deputy Secretary of State in Arkansas, and so how concerning is this to you?
It's concerning in some ways that people are still thinking that election denying is a winning formula, because I don't think that it is. I will say, having overseen elections in the state of Arkansas, there are many checks and balances up and down the ticket and up and down the level of state government and the election process. You have the Secretary of State, but also each county has people overseeing the election process and how these are tabulated. And I think I have full faith and confidence in the integrity of our elections. I think we need to do more to instill that. But again,
but Alice, just so I'm clear,
be,
if the Secretary of State herself in a battleground state or wherever is an election denier, can those checks and balances keep her in check, or is she the final arbiter of this?
Look, they can keep her in check. There are many people that have done this as a nonpartisan career for their entire lives, and they're not going to be swayed by someone who is doing this for a political reason. This goes down to the county level. People have been doing this for many years, and being part of the election process is important to them. And they will speak up, and they will make sure that the elections are free and fair. And that's the most important thing we can do, taking away, is make sure people understand that they need to go vote. The election process is free and fair, regardless if you win or lose. And we need to make sure that we vote to have people that oversee these elections that are doing it for all the right reasons, and that is for our great democracy.
We pray you're right. Alice, Zach, thank you both very much.
Thank you.